So how about that House of the Dragon episode?
Oh, it was
that
so
aired
good.
on Sunday.
I've definitely seen it already.
Right.
It was so good.
We had a great episode about it on Tuesday. That would be our most recent episode if you're listening on YouTube or
sure
Spotify
would.
or anywhere else. Or if you want to know, hey, where's this House of the Dragon thing going? We did chapter by chapter coverage of House of the Dragon, which is the source material that the show is based on.
Oh, that's
you
true.
can find that over on Patreon. We have 8 volumes of voluminous discussion of us running through that book. So I think it's some of the best analytical work we've ever done. But that is not why we've all gathered here today.
No,
we are here
it's
for the
not.
next chapter of the mainline Game of Thrones series.
That's right.
That would be Sansa number 2.
Yes, it is very funny to be recording this before that episode has actually come into existence, but I'm assuming it's going to be great, and I hope that you enjoy our discussion that we're going to have about it in the future, but is already up in the past for you.
So what happened in this chapter, Sansa number 2?
Let me tell you. So if you haven't been here, hi, welcome. We're reading through the Game of Thrones books chapter by chapter. We are quite a few in at this point, but this is only our second one with Sansa. Quick spoiler reminder, we have already read the books and seen the show, so we're going to spoil lots and lots of things. Let's do a recap of this chapter, and then we'll talk about it. So this is Sansa number 2. The hand's tourney has arrived. Finally, Sansa's absolutely thrilled. She ends up watching jousting all day next to her friend Jane Poole, and she is determined to be the absolute best lady she can be while watching this tournament. She's very poised and composed, and she even wins the favor of Sir Loras Tyrell. And she has the best time. There are a couple little things that happen in here. One is that one man does actually die right in front of her, courtesy of the Mountain, aka Sir Gregor Clegane, aka Sandor Clegane, the Hound's brother. So a guy dies in front of her, but she remains very calm and is almost fascinated by it. It's very interesting. Also near the end of the day, Littlefinger goes up to her and is super gross and creepy. He touches her hair and he's like, "You look like your mother." And she's like, "Who are you?" And she learns who he is, but doesn't really understand who he is. So that happens. But then the tourney ends for the day. They're going to resume the next day. Then they have a big feast, and she sits next to Joffrey, and he's so nice to her all night, and she's in this dreamlike state. She's drunk on the joy and magic of the night, and she's having the best time.
And the ice wine.
Yes, she is also having ice wine. But then, at least it's not iced milk. Dear God, at least it's not sweetened iced milk. But then the feast comes to a very sudden end because King Robert is absolutely drunk off his ass, and he is screaming at his wife, Cersei. He says that he's going to fight the next day, and she can't tell him what to do because he's the king. And so then everybody kind of agrees, okay, well, this feast is over. So everybody kind of goes home. And Joffrey ends up having the Hound escort Sansa back to the Red Keep. And Sansa has been terrified of the Hound since the moment she saw him because he's got this pretty intense burn on his face. He's also just a tall and scary guy. And as they're heading back together, he can tell that she's afraid to look at him. And he's drunk and tired. He fought in the tourney that day, so he's worn out. And he basically just makes her look at him and ends up telling her the story of how he got this injury. We learned that when he was about 5 or 6 years old, his brother Sandor, who's 5 years older than him.
He's Sandor.
I'm sorry, his brother Gregor. Why do they got to do this? Why do they got to name them all the same names? This is my
Hey, we don't have any Aegons in this book.
That's true. This is my constant struggle, is the names in this series, but whatever. So his brother Gregor, who's 5 years older than him, held his face down in some hot coals because Sandor stole his brother's toy, and Gregor was not having it, so he smashed his face into hot coals for a good long while, permanently burning and scarring him and maiming him for the rest of his life. And Sansa, that ends up making her feel sympathetic towards the Hound, and she finds that she's no longer afraid of him. She's just kind of sad for him. And when they get back to her apartments at the Red Keep, he makes her swear not to tell anybody what he told her and says, "If you do, I will kill you." And so that's where that chapter ends. It's so fun. So
very
interesting.
Revealing.
Yes.
I got a lot out of this chapter. I think this one reminded me a little bit of the Catelyn chapter we just read, in that I don't list either of these characters as my favorites. When I'm watching the show, when I'm just thinking about the series, they don't come to mind for me. But I'm finding their chapters in the book incredibly rich and rewarding.
Yeah, I think maybe it's because Sansa's are so few. I think that might be this is only the second one we had, but we've had a lot of Catelyns. So.
I'm more talking about Catelyn, but I think this was a big step up for Sansa as well.
I think so too.
And it played to a lot of the same themes that I tried to foreground last week when we talked about Catelyn's chapter. So I'm excited to go back to some of those ideas. I like the way you did the recap because so much of this chapter is engaging with classical fantasy iconography.
Definitely.
And I like that you talked about the knights and the different people that she sees and names. There are a lot of fun names and kind of quiet character introductions in this chapter.
Right. A lot of guys who's like, okay, I know they're going to come back and be important later. But in the moment, it's just like they're in the whole swathe of different knights that we're being introduced to.
Swathe?
Is that the word?
Swath?
Swathe. Swath. What is wrong with me today?
Swathe.
Whatever. The whole swath. The whole swath. Let's just say it that way.
If you hadn't said it so confidently, I wouldn't.
I really had to think about it before I said it. And then I was like, that wasn't right. Isn't it? Whatever.
I saw a tweet the other day. It was like, nothing in this world is funnier than someone you love mispronouncing a basic word.
I feel like I did the same thing pretty recently.
You did.
Okay.
I didn't say anything.
All right.
Do you know what the word was?
Oh, it was brothership. I confidently said brothership on this show, dear listener.
But it was
I
such
meant
a good point.
brotherhood and fellowship, and
Everyone
I said them
knew
both.
what you meant.
You said village and origin story on the Patreon last week, and
Village
I didn't
and
call
origin?
You said village and origin story.
Well, subscribe to hear more of those little screw-ups. So yeah, even before we know the names of all these guys, this is Sansa watching basically a bunch of action figures running around.
Right.
This is her relishing in the classical knight archetype. And we know that most of these guys don't live up to that ideal.
Oh, certainly not.
But that's what we're introducing here, long after we, as the reader, know better. We know that none of these guys are pure as the driven snow, despite Jaime's cloak being this beautiful, virginal white. We know none of that is real.
Right. And like Sansa doesn't yet. And so we're enjoying getting to watch her discover these things.
That's what I want to play with, because I think that was my first instinct as well, is, it's an insight about Sansa. She doesn't know yet that none of this is real, so she still has an innocence or an idealism. I think that's the kind of the first blush impression you have.
Right.
But there are constant references to these archetypical guys being imperfect, because the knights that are named, or guys dressed up as knights who are named, it's Jaime Lannister, the Mountain, the Hound. Like, she knows enough about Jaime being
That's
a
true.
Kingslayer. Growing up with Stark parents, there's no way she's idolizing Jaime Lannister.
Yeah, and we don't really see her do that here. She just notices him and notices how good he looks, but that's it.
And she's already scared of the Hound.
Right.
And the Mountain is physically imposing in his own right. Sidebar, I loved that we got a little quiet introduction to young Beric Dondarrion.
Me too. I didn't know he was in this. I was so excited
Like
to see
we were
him there.
talking with Catelyn last week. And
Right.
He's the guy who will, he's the guy who will eventually resurrect her into Lady Stoneheart. I was saying that chapter was the birth of that Lady Stoneheart idea.
Yeah, so that's
now,
totally here.
In the following chapter, we get introduced to the guy who will bring her back. So that was fun.
So cool.
But back to this central question about Sansa. Does she or does she not know better? Because like I said, she knows the stories about Jaime, and she's experienced, as the chapters roll on here, she's seen more and more the horrors of the world. Look at last chapter, what happened with her dog, Lady,
right.
the direwolf, being killed. And Bran, she knows about what's happened to Bran. She's got some, I wouldn't say this chapter is an introduction to the problem of evil for her.
No.
I would say this is like baby steps. She's experienced some evil and some bad stuff in the world. I think this chapter is more of a stern negotiation with the problem of evil. Because it's not that she only sees the beautiful parts of this day. It's that she actively has to quiet down and shush and excuse the bad parts. Like, yes, running around this tournament, it's just like the great songs. Yes, a guy died 10 feet away from me and I watched him bleed out, but look, it was like just like the songs.
Right, and she's like actively performing. She's like,
Yes.
I know how a lady is supposed to, act at a tournament, so I'm not going to react. So she's like actively working to make it nice and beautiful. And like we see her do that with Joffrey too. When like after the tournament ends and they go to the feast, she hasn't talked to Joffrey since the thing with Lady. And so she's very nervous about it. But it says like at first she thought she hated him for what they'd done to Lady. But after Sansa had wept her eyes dry, she told herself that it had not been Joffrey's doing, not truly. The queen had done it. She was the one who to hate. Her and Arya, nothing bad would have happened except for Arya. So she like convinces herself to look at this in a more romantic lens. So she's aware of the horrors of the problem of evil, but she actively tries to change her reality to suit what she wants.
It is. I'm glad you used the word performance. I think that's fascinating. And I would add that it's an incredibly difficult performance for her.
Yeah.
And I don't want it to seem like I'm condemning the character. I think it's perfectly normal and incredibly human to bargain with the problem of evil and negotiate that unfamiliar, tricky terrain, especially early on. I think the more interesting question is, does Sansa think that it's a fair trade? Like, yes, I have to watch a guy die 10 feet away from me, but I get to see all the pretty fantasy archetypes if I don't pay attention to that part. I think that's the work that she's doing in this chapter. It reminded me of the sort of negotiation that we've had to do in the Fire and Blood episodes over on Patreon. That is not a real-time narrative, talking about this Targaryen civil war that we're seeing in House of the Dragon. They're dramatizing the source material for the show, but the source material itself is written as an assembled history. It's this maester pulling together a bunch of different depictions and versions of events from previous maesters and trying to negotiate what the truth is. So those discussions have made me comfortable with all of these parsing historical ambiguities in Fire and Blood. But here, back in the real-time narrative, I think this version of events is just as shaky in this one POV. I don't think it's any more clean or objective because, like you said, she's actively trying to ignore what she's seeing with her own eyes, trying to convince herself not to hate or blame Joffrey. She says he's too beautiful to hate, even though he just killed her dog.
Right.
Like, there's as much bias and emotion and messiness and survival instinct and unreliable narrator and self-interest. This is just as blurry as anything we're getting in Fire and Blood. It's just as human. And I like that instead of having a maester negotiate historical ambiguities, we're having the reader do that work to negotiate and navigate all of that tricky humanity in the real-time narrator.
Yeah, I do like that a lot. That's a really fun comparison. And I think that what she's doing here is, of course, what she's been taught to do, which is to perform, act in the appropriate way, and act like everything is fine, and make things as good as you can with the power that you have. I mean, we see this like determination to ignore the ugly played out in the tournament itself, because not only is Sansa like pretending like everything's fine as a man bleeds out 10 feet away from her, but after he dies, it says that after they carried off the body, a boy with a spade ran onto the field and shoveled dirt over the spot where he had fallen to cover up the blood. Then the joust resumed. So they also just like quietly put it aside, cover it up, pretend everything is fine, and continue on with all the performance and the falsity of everything, right? Just like putting on the show of the tournament, because everything has to be fun and lovely and romantic. And so Sansa is trying her very best to do what societally she is supposed to do, like, and she's doing it really well. She's doing it better than Jane Poole, who freaks out and has to be like taken away and can't come back to the tournament because she's so upset because she saw a man die in front of her.
She had a normal, less of a performed response.
Right, she had a much more human response, and Sansa is trying so hard to turn off her humanity.
Sansa's trying to order life a la carte. And just order a bunch of the good stuff and ignore all the bad stuff. Like it's this buffet and you can just avoid the evil table and you don't have to have any of the human suffering. I thought moving from this being a joust and all of this performed, staged, false sort of combat, moving from that to the feast, I thought George R. Martin almost used this navigation of the problem of evil that we're talking about. I think he almost layered that into this kind of food metaphor, this sort of shorthand, because it became about indulgence. Yeah. It became about King Robert as the number one glutton of this world. But it's not just about him eating a lot of food so he's overweight. It was that he is the platonic ideal in this world of willful ignorance. Yeah. And I think you see him as almost the like reductio ad absurdum, the logical extension of what Sansa's doing here. That if you do ignore all the bad stuff and just try to overdose on the good stuff for long enough, you'll end up like him.
Right. We even see Sansa playing with that. It says that there's like 1,000 courses and she's eaten all these things. And it says by the time they get to the dessert, she's like, I don't think I can eat anything. But she does manage to eat 2 little lemon cakes. And then it says she's contemplating having a third. And then Robert's outburst happens. So she's also engaging in that indulgence that Robert does.
Right. And it almost plays into conversations we've had in the last few weeks about temptation. I think there's some of that here with the finery and the beauty and the fantasy ideals. She's trying to live up to that and give herself over to it. But I enjoyed the tension that underlies that, because there's so much give and take happening in her head here. There's so much of her trying to convince herself that everything's okay and she's having a great time, while ignoring, oh, remember what Joffrey said last time I saw him? Remember when they killed my dog? Also, this is the Hand's tourney. Supposed to be celebrating her dad. She doesn't even try to go see her dad because she's
Sorry, go ahead.
She's so caught up in this performance.
Yeah. We don't get a mention of Ned at all. We have no idea where he is or what he's doing during this. And she doesn't know or care either. Arya's not there either. She is not thinking about them.
And I think you could say that that's malicious, that she just cares about the experience and she doesn't care about, this is supposed to be about her dad. But I think it's more that this performance is such difficult work for her that there's no brain space left for that.
Right.
But all of that work, that grueling, miserable work that she's doing under the surface, I would have been sad if the chapter just left that there for us to puzzle out, because I think engaging that within the narrative is much more rewarding for the characterization. You always talk about loving when these things just devolve into character work. And that's what I got out of the second half of this chapter. We haven't talked about distillation echoes in a while, but I need to here, because it's not just this chapter talked about something, the next chapter talked about it in a much more rough and ready sort of way to exaggerate those proportions and make the comparison so rude and obvious that we have to talk about. It wasn't that. It was that we get the distillation echo one page after we get the end of the original idea.
Oh, okay.
It's the Hound. Mm-hmm. The chapter begins with, this is Sansa's POV, and she's playing with all of these action figures of knights, and then she watches a guy die horribly. Then the Hound shows up, and he gives us his backstory of him as a child playing with an action figure of a knight, and then his brother tries to kill him.
Interesting.
So we're interrupted by the problem of evil, and that shatters these childlike fantasies that we have.
Yes.
And that comparison, it comes so immediate. The parallels are so explicit. I think it makes it more brutal and even harder to ignore. It makes Sansa, like her mother, as a character, I think she becomes a grindstone for characterization. Because how many other tragic backstories have we gotten so far? Ned's chapters are him trying to piece together hereditary gene pools. Everyone else is trying to navigate the new world they're thrown into. Dany's trying to survive. Jon is trying to survive. They're trying to make friends.
We did get Sam's backstory in our last Jon chapter.
That's
true.
That's
I thought of that immediately. It's like, oh, another side character tragic flashback. But otherwise, I think that's kind of it.
I like how vulnerable this was with the Hound. And I think it reveals a couple things. One, it might speak to Sansa having an ability to talk to people and get something out of them. It makes her approachable and vulnerable in a way that people can sympathize with and open up to. But it also, there's sort of a backhanded compliment here. The Hound is relating to a teenage girl.
Right. Yeah.
And that means that he has some level, I think, of arrested development on his part.
Oh, yeah. Of course he does, yeah.
He's sort of emotionally stunted at the time of his scarring and torture from his brother, which I think that you can call his singular suffering.
Yeah.
That is his defining trauma for the Hound. And he never escapes that shadow as long as he lives. And then he dies pretty much trying to kill his brother.
Right. And even now, his job is to serve a 12-year-old prince.
Who calls him a dog.
Yeah, like he's beneath the 12-year-old. So, of course, he's going to feel that weird arrested development that you talk about.
And that brings me back to the very early conversations we had about the Starks when we're talking about Bran falling. We're talking about Ned dying. We're talking about the Red Wedding. All of these characters, because this story is the Stark story, all of these characters have a defining trauma. And I think the scary part of this chapter is our certainty, because we're in Sansa's POV. We're getting some of her reflections on recent horrible events. It's our certainty that Sansa's defining trauma has not yet happened. It's not Lady and it's not Bran.
Nope.
But we know everyone's number is going to get called here. So I think there's some kind of hype dread for this character.
Sure,
We're seeing the roller coaster ratchet up to the top of and I think there's a lesson underneath that too. When I was talking about the Hound of all people feeling comfortable enough to open up to her, that speaks to a certain talent that she has. We're seeing Arya's talent start to blossom. We're seeing her training in sword fighting, a skill that will serve her later. I think we might have a similar sort of genesis moment with Sansa here. And I think one of her powers is this navigation of humanity. It's this skill for communication because she is vulnerable. I don't think it's like, she's not naive. She's not dumb.
She's not.
She's not innocent.
It's so easy to classify her that way, and that's not what she is.
There's a vulnerability. But the lesson of the chapter, which the Hound, I mean, he explicitly says to her, he sort of just speaks the lesson of the chapter to her, is that vulnerability is incredibly dangerous in this world.
Yes, right, yes.
And if you look at literally every other character named in the chapter, they are surviving because they are not doing what Sansa is doing here. The lesson is that it's better to hide and guard yourself and mask yourself. Rattling off examples here, Robert hiding in his wine goblet. The Hound does the same thing here. Jaime hides behind a big lion helm and doesn't speak honestly to anyone. Robert spills wine on him and pushes him into the mud, and he doesn't say anything.
Right.
Cersei hides behind this like Ice Queen blank face.
Right, says nothing. Yeah.
Littlefinger hides behind this ambiguity of not even introducing himself, but having this weird false familiarity with Sansa. Loras Tyrell is masking his identity and making this public show of being attracted to a woman.
Right.
We know he's not. Joffrey is hiding his wounds from a direwolf attack and his shame of their previous exchange. Everyone else in this chapter is hiding and masking. No one is vulnerable here except Sansa. And that's why we get the sense that she is in the most danger.
Right. And she's not doing that at first, because at first she's also trying to do that performance. Yes. She goes on an interesting journey here. Like, she starts out by like fully masking and absolutely performing and trying to do like what she thinks is the right thing to do. And then as like things come in and interrupt that and disrupt that beautiful false reality she's created for herself, that starts to break her down, and she moves into this more human, vulnerable space. I'm glad you talked about all of this, because I sort of had I kind of want to lay out the journey she goes through here, because one thing that was sticking out to me was this idea of seen and unseen and silence and noise. And I know I talked about that a lot in the first chunk of this book, and I want to return to it here just for a minute because it was so present here. And I was thinking about what I talked about in our first Sansa chapter. And back then I talked a lot about how Sansa is really observant and clever and knows like what to perform or display, but that she can be blind to a lot. She sort of has almost like selective hearing, but also in seeing as well as hearing. Like in that first chapter, she's like not paying attention to the landscape until Joffrey tells her about it. She like can't see how things are affecting Arya. She can't see Joffrey for who he truly is. And then that all kind of falls apart when we get the Lady Mycah Nymeria incident. But here she continues to do this, but she is like that mask falls as the chapter goes on, and she really dives into this moment of humanity. And I think the Hound is the key there, because at the beginning she starts with wearing almost a literal pair of rose-colored glasses. She's in this litter that's described as having curtains of yellow silk that turned the whole world gold. So she's viewing the whole tourney and everything around her through this filter, and it's like this lens of romance, and she's like not fazed by the death of that knight like we talked about. And when Sir Loras wins his last match and the loser is like not dead but injured, is being carried off, it says Sansa never saw it. Her eyes were only for Sir Loras, and she was struck dumb by his gallantry. So she literally is blinded and muted by this romance, the reality that she's trying to create around herself. You pointed out at the feast, she says that Joffrey is too beautiful to hate, as in he looks too good. She refuses to see him for who he truly is. And it says that she was drunk on the magic of the night, swept away by beauties she had dreamt of all her life. So everything looks great and amazing to her. But what we see throughout the day is that these moments are broken and disrupted by signs of danger. That's what sort of breaks that lens that she's placing over her eyes. With Littlefinger, she notices that she's able to observe that his eyes did not smile when his mouth did. She looks at him for 2 seconds, but like Ned has never noticed that about Littlefinger in all the conversations he's had with him. Like, he knows not to trust him. He knows he's weird, but that just like immediately like totally observant and aware moment of Sansa is, I think, really telling. Like, she looks at him for 2 seconds and knows, I don't trust this guy. And then, of course, so she feels unsafe around him, so that barrier is sort of broken. Same thing happens with Robert's outburst. It says that, she notices Joffrey's cruelty in that moment. It says that he had a queer look on his face as if he were not seeing her at all. And she notices Cersei's, like you talked about, she's putting up this mask, this wall. She's very, like, Lannisterian in that way. We talked about how the Lannisters, the way that they survive is by hiding and being quiet. And it says that, the queen's face was a mask and she stormed off in silence. But of course, the most disruptive moment is with the Hound. And that's when Sansa's humanity really comes out. Because at first, it says that she could feel the Hound watching her. And that feels very, like, intense to her. And also, her powers of observation come through here because she recognizes that he's mocking her at one point. And she is able to see the humanity in him after she learns the truth about his past. And so this is truly her transition, because the Hound is able to pull her out of the performance. Like, what triggers him telling that story is when she's talking about the mountain, she says, like, no one could withstand him. Because she wasn't sure what to say because she doesn't want to be rude, but she's trying to still be polite and ladylike. And he's so angered by this performance she's putting on. And that's when he starts to call her a pretty little bird, like just saying what she is supposed to say. And
he's calling her out.
Yes, and he's calling her out for that lie, for the mask that she's wearing. Because she also thinks to herself, a true lady would not notice his face. Like, she's trying not to look. She's trying to do the ladylike performance thing. And he pulls her out of that. He knows that she saw what happened with the mountain. And she also says, like, take a good long stare. You want to, when talking about his face. And after he tells her that story, it says that she was sad for him. Somehow the fear had gone away. And so that's when, like, she then, like, transitions into saying the truth instead of lying. Because it then says, the silence went on and on, so long that she began to be afraid once more. But she was afraid for him now, not for herself. He was no true knight, she whispered. And so she finally tells the truth. She's able to, it's still, like, a very polite thing to say. Like, she doesn't say he's, a terrible person. She says
the mountain.
Yeah, she's talking about the mountain. Yeah. So she's being honest, still in, like, a Sansa way, but she's being honest. And also what I think is great about this whole conversation with the Hound, or this whole scene, is that they're walking through the dark. And over and over and over, the Hound is described as, like, this shadow in the night, like this dark, figure that you can't see. But she is able to see him. She is able to observe and recognize his humanity. And you talked about her vulnerability, why the Hound opens up to her. I think it's because after he's able to kind of break through her performance and her vulnerability can really come out, he's able to, like, feel how well she can see him. Like, she can, like, literally and metaphorically see who he is and see his humanity. So he feels, on top of being drunk and tired and angry, he feels comfortable enough telling that story, even though he then asks her not to tell anybody or he'll kill her. But I think that's, like, it's her vulnerability, and it's just her ability to see and understand people in a way that I think a lot of other people don't. I think everybody else in this world, a lot of other people in this world, are very self-obsessed and very, like, focused on how they're coming across and what they're thinking about. Sansa is worried about how she comes across, but it's, like, in reference to other people. She's so observant of other people.
But there is a self-obsession that underlies that performance.
Yeah.
When it is your number one job and role in the world. I love this overarching dichotomy. I think you've made me think much more about the Hound than I had before. But when I was talking about Robert being the most visible paragon of this type of royal performance, the Hound is the other path. If there are these two possible futures being laid out in front of Sansa, one is all-time, all-consuming, lose yourself in the performance. That's how you end up the sort of gluttonous, indulgent Robert.
Yeah.
The other side is you don't perform, you don't play the game, and you're completely ignored. You shrink into the shadows, and you end up like the Hound.
Okay.
And I think maybe that's why Arya gets along better with the Hound, because she takes that approach, and Sansa tries to play the game longer. She eventually gets good at the game and sort of succeeds in that quarter. But I like her being presented with these two paths in this early pivotal moment, because the Hound is not performing. He's abstaining. That's why he hides in the shadows. But he's maybe, you're right, I guess it's those two characters that aren't performing. Maybe I should have broadened that definition earlier.
Yeah.
Zooming out to look at how the narrative is judging these two characters. We've been talking about this lately, even in the Fire and Blood episodes over on Patreon. We're talking about the nature of justice a lot in this world, in the last chapter, based on how the Targaryen civil war that we're talking about in House of the Dragon, how that will eventually wrap up. We've been talking about that over on Patreon. Go check that out. I won't spoil that. But
No.
here, I want to talk a little bit about how the narrative is discussing these characters who don't perform. Because I think drawing such a sharp comparison that you have to go back and question every other character who's named in the chapter, and you think less of them because they're all faking it. They're all hedging. They're all kind of selling out. They're not as virtuous and consistent, maybe, as Sansa and the Hound are trying to be here. I think even though this vulnerability is so clearly dangerous and maybe not the smartest choice to make, I think there's an incredible underlying narrative admiration for the Hound and Sansa here. I'm not speaking to author's intent, but I'm guessing at it.
Sure.
It looks like there is a nod of approval here. That this tact of vulnerability is incredibly brave, and this earnestness that these characters bring to human interaction of not lying and bullshitting and masking and dodging, that is something incredibly admirable in this rough and tumble world.
Yeah, but and then he immediately balances it and by reminding us and Sansa at the end, oh, and if you tell anybody else, I will literally kill you. He's saying it is dangerous to do this in this world, but perhaps because of that, it's all the more admirable and is the right way, the right thing to do if you do it in the right way, around the right people and in the right circumstances, and still keep secrets in certain ways, right? So I think you're right. It's that is the best way for these characters to protect each other and connect with one another, because we know that the Hound is going to be a kind of protector for Sansa for a long time. I mean, their relationship is never happy and joyful and never reaches the level that his and Arya's reaches. But we know that they're gonna sort of be friends in a really strange way, and that vulnerability is essential for that to happen.
And I think you could argue that part of what he's doing for Arya is on Sansa's behalf.
I think so too. Yeah, I think also because Arya reminds him of her, reminds him of himself.
Oh, of course, yeah.
But
I love the way the metaphors are physicalized and then abstracted again and again throughout this chapter, where you have Sandor Clegane has the visible scars of the problem of evil, where Sansa's are so far not visible.
Yes, right.
Right? You can't tell just by looking at her that her brother fell out of a tower and her dog was just killed. But him, you can see exactly what's happened to him. And I love this almost ghost of Christmas future that he's acting as in this chapter. I mean, this is 7 pages?
Yeah.
And short. I got so much out of this.
Me too.
Deep, just avalanche deep characterization. It reminded me a lot of Catelyn, and I really enjoyed these pages.
Me too. I liked it a lot. Sansa, I keep saying it, she's one of my favorite characters ever. I think she's so interesting, and she's so unlike any of the other characters in this story. I think that's also why I like her so much.
I'm getting more out of her so far.
I'm so happy to hear that. Yeah, because again, it's so easy to dismiss her as this naive idiot who needs to learn how to grow up. And in some ways she is that, but she's a lot more than that. And I love this. This has been fun.
Cool. Well, as usual, we're heading back to Ned for the next chapter.
Oh, are we?
But
awesome.
Also, we will be right there with you on Sunday watching House of the Dragon, and then we will have our next discussion up on Tuesday. And if you want the Fire and Blood discussions, where we go through all of the source material for House of the Dragon, it is so much fun, those episodes. We get into real big ideas.
We do.
Those are over on Patreon, but just for today's Game of Thrones episode, I want to thank everyone for listening, for supporting the show. The community's fantastic. The comments are fantastic. This is so much fun to do. We're in our sweep season going through House of the Dragon right now. Been waiting for this for 2 years. So thank you for joining us for the ride. I never expected when we started this show we'd be doing 3 George R. R. Martin episodes a week, but here we are.
Yep.
And it's a lot of fun. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for making this possible.
Yes, thank you so much. Let us know what you thought in the comments down below if you're on YouTube or Patreon, or you can just send us an email, secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com. And if you're on YouTube, subscribe, all that. That's really helpful. If you want to catch more of our Game of Thrones episodes, we got a whole playlist. If for some reason this is where you started, we got a whole playlist, so check that out. But otherwise, we'll see you guys on Tuesday, if not Friday.
All right. Have a good weekend. Bye.